without further ado, I wanted to invite Leslie, our moderator for today, to get us started.
Hey, good evening, and I guess if you guys want to jump up here, we'll go ahead and get our seats and get this conversation going. So we have a fun panel today. We'll start with a little bit of a global vision of what's happening in smart mobility and then drill into some really detailed angles. We have a great panel here, which once we get set up, I'll have you guys introduce briefly, and then we'll get started with the questions, if that works. While we're having discussions, please do use the Slido app and put in some questions. I'll be checking in on them and make sure that any that you upgrade that you really like that someone else has posted we'll incorporate to the discussion here. All right, so first up, I'll start on the far side. Paul, if you want to introduce yourself with.
Hey everybody, my name is Paul Lafata. I'm with Lab 1886. It's an incubator lab for Daimler and Mercedes-Benz. And so what we do is create new products and new businesses to take Daimler more from just a car and truck company to a mobility company. So we're exploring lots of ideas into lots of things in the connected, autonomous, and shared world.
Hi, I'm Ellen Sassone. I'm from SAP, big software company, German software company, deep roots in automotive. I'm from Detroit, so I have my own deep roots in automotive. I've been focused a lot on mobility, which turns out there's a lot of women also focused on mobility, so it's been a neat space. We do a lot of, anyway, I'm happy to be here in Atlanta, so thank you.
Can everyone hear me? So hello, my name is Matt Newman. I'm with Oracle. I'm the director of our customer service public sector practice. The other software giant, I guess, on this stage. Here to share some of my experience working with public transit agencies around the country. Very interesting that I'm sitting right between the private sector and the public sector, which is, at the heart of many of the questions these days.
I was wondering if you need me to sit in between the two.
Yeah.
If it gets contentious a little bit later, I understand. Frenemies. I'm Kirk Talbot, CIO for MARTA.
Fantastic. And again, I'm Leslie Langley, and I'm a smart communities and mobility technology specialist at AECOM, a global engineering firm with a strong presence here in town. So we do work with clients like MARTA and the state DOTs. Or at least I do, but there are many aspects that happen. So let's get into it. From y'all's perspective, as you guys can tell, we have a good mix of private and public agencies. Sure? I was on the wrong side. All right, let's start globally. What are the latest trends in smart mobility that excite you? I guess it was getting contentious already.
It's sharing the microphone, that's all. Make it easier.
I'm going to use my notes. So again, what are the latest trends in smart mobility that excite you? What are some experiments you're seeing that you would like to see that could be replicated in different communities of any scale?
Can I go first? For me, I was just talking about this in a different context, but the reuse of used cars, to me, is kind of a very exciting, there's a huge car park out there, 1.7 trillion cars globally. Cars live longer. Automakers have done such a great job making them last. So the reuse, new business models coming up with used cars, to me is just fascinating. And because a lot of people can't afford a lease or a huge car payment, but what you can do with a used car, even as an Uber driver, to me is pretty neat economically. So.
I'm excited by some very early experiments in microtransit within the public transit sector. So applying the lessons that have been learned from the Uber and Lyft world, the Birds, the OFOs, whatnot, over to the public sector side, but doing it in a way that's economically sustainable and does not require forever VC capital. So there's some very interesting things happening in that space.
Yes, and I'd second that. Likewise, I'm very interested in what is the public sector's role in the new transportation world. I'll give you for instance, last week I was at a conference in my hometown in Phoenix. Traveling downtown, I live about 25 miles north of the city. There are 3 apps on my phone: Waze for my car, Uber for car lift, and I've got Move It for public transportation. Uber calculated out to be about $75 round trip. I took the corporate reimbursement rate of 52 cents a mile and figured out that, you know, with the parking, it was about $40 with my own vehicle to go to the conference for the day. Public transit, obviously much more affordable, but didn't give me a good option in terms of getting there on time. There was a long wait for the bus from where I live out in the suburbs, and there was also a difficult set of connections for me to get downtown. You know, what did I do? I drove my car. So bad boy. But that's kind of the thing those are kind of the issues that people are facing right now in terms of, you know, is an agency like MARTA a viable public option for people who especially have, you know, longer or more variable commutes? And it's a difficult question. I think it's an engineering question. It's a technology question. There's a lot of pieces that need to come together to really support a good answer.
For me, you know, I have a background in tech and design, and also recently worked in micromobility and helped Bird design the original app a couple years ago. So for me, I'm interested in the scooter part. And I think for whether you love them or hate them, if you hate them, I apologize. But you know, no doubt, it's taking cities in a new direction now, and really really understanding how is smart cities going to operate in the future. And I think the micromobility is a big part of that, and so I'm interested in seeing where that goes in the future, as well as other technology advancements like 5G and how that interoperates with other systems like the smart light poles or the micromobility or roads and things like that. And I'm really interested in seeing where that goes.
Wow. I'm going to pick on you, Kirk, a little bit. Well, first of all, how many of you guys live in the metro area? Okay, excellent. I bet not everyone knows what MARTA's up to. What innovative things are coming out of MARTA. So I want to ask if you would share what you guys are up to, because the Super Bowl had some good energy behind it, and I know you guys moved some ideas around. And also tacking onto that from the rest of you guys, what exciting projects are you working on, or is your company working on that you'd like to share with the audience? Sure.
There's a lot going on at MARTA. Not all of it's obvious. There's been a recent pivot within within MARTA to address some of the core fundamentals of transit. Get the customer experience really is what it boils back to where it should be. In addition, there's going to be a whole bunch of expansion. There's some bonds that were passed. There's expansion of services within Fulton and Clayton County. But I think from a wireless and a technology standpoint, one of the things that we're focusing on, again, is that customer experience. So after we get kind of the fundamental quality issues that we've got at MARTA that have been a legacy issue, we're really going to be focusing on the mobile application. And I like what you talk about, because one of the things we discuss internally is what is the role of the not-for-profit side of mobility. I think the for-profit side of mobility, you know, with the OEMs and all the people that are operating over there, is they're probably a little bit further ahead on the curve, but we're talking about what can we do on the nonprofit side to take that from 3 apps to maybe 2 or 1 app. So you don't have to determine what mode you're going to take before you start planning your trip, right? Because that's a hard calculus. Where we really want to get to, and what we're talking about internally, it's not we're delivering next week, but I want to be clear on that, is how do we make it easier for doing that trip planning so that you look at truly all modes, and then you pick the best mode. I don't shame people for taking a car. I drive to work. If that's the best mode for you, by all means take it. We're in the business of providing alternatives, and we want to win by giving you a better alternative to the car. No offense, you know.
No offense taken.
So-
I love making profit in fancy cars.
I think one exciting thing about public transportation, and I did live in Manhattan for 5 years, and I rode the subway I loved living there and not having a car, right? Which it's a very liberating feeling not to have a car. But I have two comments about community, which is kind of a different perspective. But when you get on the subway, and I don't know how many people are going to take the subway home tonight. Anyone? Okay. There's a community feeling there that you get that you don't get except, and this is going to be even weirder, in an Uber right now, today with a human being. Once we get to autonomous, things will be different. But you know, you're in a car with someone you don't even know. And generally, I don't know, do you talk to your Uber driver? Yeah. It's like you'd never meet them otherwise, right? I think the subway's the same way, or a public bus. I lived in Boston, took the bus. Like, there's something about bringing people together that I do think is super powerful about what you offer, and it's good for America. I know I sound like a politician, but you're
It is good. I'll add to that too. And I think whether that is the MARTA or whatever that is, I think what Kirk's hitting on, which is near and dear to my heart, is that customer experience. And I think you can't go wrong if you always center it around that and what's good for the customer. Sometimes that seems like, well, of course you have to think about what's, it seems like that's a no-duh kind of thing, but there's a lot of times where it's not considered. And so I think putting that user at the center of it will always steer you in the right direction, whether that's public, private, profit, nonprofit, whatever that is.
I just have one more comment, too. And I think the move to electric vehicles is the same kind of idea. It's bigger, though, than the consumer. It's what's right for the environment. How do we make the world better?
Right.
And EV and charging and all that is a part of that change.
Yeah, so I guess I'll follow up with that. Are there any good examples that you've seen or that you've worked on that you would love to see emulated in other cities? So you guys have a partnership with Movil or with electric vehicles, getting the chargers out there, making it easier with tax incentives, or with Oracle, there's definitely a back-end process to making a mobility app or last mile app, making sure that in Atlanta, for example, we have multiple transit agencies, so multiple fare systems. So you have to buy a Cobb Link fare if you live in Cobb, and then MARTA fare if you live in MARTA. How do you make that seamless so that the user doesn't have to think about what system they're on, they're just taking transit? So.
Yeah, I guess my comment to that is there's complexity to this. You know, one of the things that you have to think about besides just the routing aspect of it on the app is the payment aspect of it as well. One of the things that, you know, is constantly interesting me now is how Uber and Lyft are getting into these different side arrangements with Southwest Airlines at Hilton. You know, when I checked into my hotel yesterday, I had a coupon right there, take Lyft back to the airport. And so, you know, to me, getting back to that customer experience aspect of this, it's not just the ability to have a planner or it's not just the aspect of having an app that shows me the routes. Payments need to be considered, for example. You know, the last thing in the world I want to do is get into an Uber in my house, 25 miles north of Phoenix, get to the depot for public transportation, and not have, you know, and worry about tokens, right? Like, you know, it defeats the purpose of having, you know, frictionless transit, which is essentially the concept. So, but I think the good news, you know, if you can take on that complexity, you know, in terms of the routing, in terms of the payments, in terms of some of the back end pieces to this, I actually think there's some new business models as well, which public transportation agencies could take advantage of. You know, there was obviously a deal between Lyft and Hilton, which took place, which put that coupon in my car. Is there a deal that could take place between MARTA and Uber, which would provide an alternate source of revenue to the public sector transit agency? While you've got someone totally captive and bored for 45 minutes out to the suburbs, is there a digital marketing angle that public transit could take a look at? So to me, there's challenges. It's complicated, but there's tremendous opportunity here in terms of taking a look at some of these new business models, and I think it's certainly something that we're going to have to focus a lot of attention on. There's a lot of detail there, but I think worth putting minds to.
So we're seeing blockchain as an obvious authentication medium in the future. I also think EV itself kind of creates new opportunities, especially for the retail side of automotive. You have Cox Automotive down here, AutoNation. Something else is going to start coming out of those dealerships with charging, with maybe offering other experiences. So I think it changes the world. Anyway, I think dealerships are going to start emerging in a different way, offering different experiences or rentals, wherever that goes. But EV does change people's time and the way it's used, and so we're going to see change.
All right. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and take in a fun question from the audience, and then we'll come back to our
Slido.
Yeah, Slido.
Okay.
So I guess drilling into this, how can public sectors utilize microtransit tech to solve the last mile problem for public transportation? And before I hand it off to you guys, I'll add that there are two cool examples in the Metro Atlanta area, one that's on the road now and one that's coming up, many others that are probably coming up. The one in Snellville is a microtransit experience that Gwinnett County Transit operates that's free to the public right now. It's Uber-like. You use the app, and it comes and picks you up and takes you wherever you need to get to. So that's pretty cool. The funny little problem there was that high school students were sleeping in and taking that to school instead of waiting for the bus, so they're having to work out some policy things. But Cobb County, they're also looking, they have Cobb Link Transit out there. They're looking at partnering with Uber because it would be cheaper to provide services that provide that last mile connectivity that they provide now. So a lot of innovative opportunities. And then, of course, we have the autonomous shuttles. There are plenty being planned for in the Metro Atlanta area. So I don't know if that stirs up a lot of thoughts in y'all's brains to provide some content. Again, the question was, how can the public sector utilize microtransit tech to solve the last mile problem for public transportation? Solve it, Kirk.
I'll take it, actually. I didn't know if my colleague at Oracle or SAP went and handled that one. But so we actually had a conversation about this yesterday. We've got an internal group that's looking at industry pilots because the industry is trying to figure this out. And there's some nuance to it. I don't think the answer will manifest the way people think it will, and it all goes back to the economics, right? Remember, one of the things I said up front was it has to be economically sustainable. Right now, if you look at the math, the Ubers and the Lyfts are not economically sustainable because they still depend on VC capital to keep operating. Public transit agencies can't do that. We have subsidies and taxes, but it has to be economically feasible. When we break it down, it turns out there's at least two markets within that have radically different economic models. One is, as mentioned, the last mile problem. How do I get from where I'm actually at to where the public transit starts to deliver service? And the other is the replacement of very expensive and underutilized service. And those are different because one is kind of a feeder system that draws people from a large catchment basin to a point. That's the first one. And the second one is I have a zone where I'm operating transit that is not economically viable. What we're seeing early on indications are that I'll say the TNC, the micro transit, is actually more viable in the latter scenario in which you're operating underperforming service. You can fill that in at a lower price point with the TNC models. The challenge with the last mile is if you're an agency that's already delivering last mile, great. If it lowers your operating costs, you'll absolutely go that way. You'll get a better customer experience. It's wonderful. If you're not operating it, what you're effectively doing is extending service to where you could not economically do it. So who's going to pay for that? The expectation is if it's associated with public transit, it's going to be subsidized by public transit. So now you're saying the taxpayer has to pay more money for service that didn't exist there before. That's not economically sustainable. One of the other challenges, and I think it's going to bear out, we will probably see it end up in that underperforming area because you can lower a transit agency's costs and actually deliver. But on the TNC, or on the last mile problem, we also run into liability issues. When you suddenly start blending the private sector and the public sector, you go, who is indemnified and who's responsible for that trip? Who gets sued if that Uber driver does something wrong? Uber says, well, we've got $1 million worth of insurance. Okay, but if it's a $5 million lawsuit because it was associated with Hilton or it was associated with MARTA, who do you think they're going to go after? Right? So we still have to figure that barrier out because the transition from public to private has all sorts of risk challenges beyond the geography, beyond the operations. The good news is that the one I'm keeping my eye on is out in Orange County, California. I think they've gotten really close to finding a sustainable model for the underperforming service. They're delivering TNC Uber-like service in a region that goes from any point to any other point, and compared to what they were paying for the fixed route service, it's a lower price point, which means it's economically sustainable. So I think we'll be able to work that out, but it probably won't take the format that people expect. And you always have to ask yourself, what's the economic model behind it?
And back to California, the state of renewable energy, green. Just south of Sacramento is a county called San Joaquin, who did what, I didn't think about the liability side of this, but using Uber, because they stretch out into farmland, so they have electric buses for the city part of Stockton, but then when you get out into the far-reaching parts of the county, you know where Stockton is? Oh, you were? Yeah. So they're using Uber, but I didn't realize there was a liability issue. And the second point you brought up about being profitable is an interesting point that what I'm seeing is purpose-built use cases, like very specific, like people in LA using a fleet, company's called Gig, it's part of AAA, to get Priuses, Priuses for surfboards for people to get from LA out to the beaches. So, and companies are being created. A lot of these startups are very focused on one use case. In Michigan,
No, go ahead. I was going to build on that.
we have a company called Rivian whose whole mission was for the mountains. That's it. That's the only reason you buy this car. I mean, so it's getting very narrow and very specific.
I was going to concur on that. I think what we're going to see in the future is very specialized services for very special niches. We're already starting to have conversations internally about where do we have spare capacity on our network, and how do you brand that and how do you package that to get the most value out of it? Well, when you start marketing to specific use cases, you can tap into untapped purposes. So for example, this isn't specific to MARTA, but I worked at a public transit agency in Austin. And no surprise, anyone that's been to Austin, Texas knows about 6th Street. Everybody knows about 6th Street, what that is? Yeah, okay. 6th Street is where the college students go and they probably drink more than they should, and then they need to get home. So there was a very specialized use case, and this has been around for years, where they operated service, let's be honest, it was the drunk bus. It was to keep people off the street, get those students home. They knew exactly where they needed to take them. They weren't trying to solve an entire regional problem. They were solving a very specialized problem. I think what you're going to see is the applications of technology and the emerging business models will be more specialized in terms of multiple use cases that you would think of as fractured, but a trip to a hotel is a very specialized type of trip, and it has a different characteristic than a trip to a job or a trip to a ball game or something like that.
Yeah, I think one of the promises of this technology is that public transit would potentially have more agility. I think of special events in cities as an example. Kind of up where I live, there's a golf tournament every year. I'm sure there's a PGA event here as well. One time a year, that's a pretty hot place, right? And funny that every single person who goes to the event, which is over 1 million people, at some point gets on a bus. It's not necessarily a public bus, but someone needs to take you to the first tee from the lot. Now, that dirt lot is pretty much useless the rest of the year. But during that week of the golf tournament, there's a tremendous need for public transportation back and forth. And I would think an avenue for profitability as well.
So kind of to get to some of the visions you guys have discussed, we have a good question from the audience. How critical is the infrastructure investment to smart transportation success? What are some examples of viable business models? So building on that, so you're talking about use cases very particular. Some use cases may not have fiber built out to them, or how do you deal, at least from the public side, which private entity you partner with? I know that gets tricky. And then also from the connected vehicle side, cellular or DSRC is a big question in a lot of people's minds. So any thoughts on those?
I think this one might be more for you public sector guys.
Or
I'll
from
take
the
it.
private sector too, if you have.
I can lay a foundation, and maybe that'll start the conversation. Having worked at the city of Atlanta, that was something that we struggled with a lot, was what's the right investment in infrastructure that not only enables better mobility, but it also enables higher level economic development that can lead to profitability and jobs and that sort of thing, right? And it's not a simple question. There isn't a silver bullet of this is the piece of infrastructure you put in and everybody wins. What we have seen, and I'll take the example of Amazon because it's well understood, I think we're entering into a phase where there will be economic competition to regions based on the investments that they have already made. One of the huge criteria that Amazon said when they looked at all their cities was, what's your public transit? What's your education? What's your fiber backbones? What does your infrastructure look like? Have you built a region that is ready for the next thing? So I can't say it's one technology. I think, I loved your point about agility. I think a smart region is one that is making those investments. And I think of like Chattanooga with its investment in its gigabit, backbone. Who knows what they're gonna do, but man, if I move to Chattanooga, I know I've got connectivity, right? So kudos to them. It's the regions that put down the flexible, universally utilizable technologies that include 5G, that include wired technologies, whatnot. So, because the next technology of tomorrow, whatever they're doing at Lab 1886 will be in some senses shaped by the investments that have already been put in place to a region.
I think that point about the city being ready or the county being ready, I just think about Detroit. There's a county called Macomb, which is just west. We have General Motors, we have Ford there. They invested in every street light, having V2X, DSRC. They did it anyway, even though we're not quite sure which technology is ultimately going to bear fruit. But they did do it, and I think it speaks to, come to your point, come invest here, because we just already made this investment and we care about this and it's important. I do have one comment though. There's a company called May Mobility, operates in Detroit, it operates in Columbus, Ohio, and it's now in Providence, Rhode Island. And they do fixed route autonomous vehicle shuttles, kind of like Los Angeles does, Las Vegas is doing that with Lyft. But these guys, there is no infrastructure, I will say, in Detroit at least, for this. And somehow they pulled it off. They do all the shuttles for a big company called Quicken Loans. It's all done by May Mobility.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things I saw on the city side is infrastructure isn't just the physical build out, it's the policy build out. The reason they were able to do that in Detroit was there was some politician that either hadn't written a law that precluded it, or they had written friendly legislation that allowed it, right? So even if you don't need a technical infrastructure, you still need a legal infrastructure that indemnifies, that basically becomes friendly to that technology. So I would argue there's always some sort of infrastructural pre-investment that enables those economic or innovative explosions.
So I'll build on that quickly. So Georgia has a pretty open autonomous vehicle statewide policy. There's no reporting, there's no nothing. Are there other legislative efforts that maybe this group could rally behind, that, or that you've seen in other cities, the business community help move forward?
I don't know of it.
There's an opportunity for a first case study.
Miami, that's where Ford decided to invest with Postmates for autonomous. I don't know the reasons they picked Miami, but they definitely doubled down on Miami. So I don't know where Mercedes or Daimler wants to focus.
Yeah, definitely Atlanta. Yeah.
There's a question here, if you guys have heard of, we have an interactive smart mobility lab in Peachtree Corners. I'll expand that out further since we have a lab representative. What do you think about interactive mobility labs or smart city labs, and what role do you hope that serves for business and community purposes?
Yeah, I mean, with our lab, we're looking at mainly new business model explorations into that, and smart cities is one of those things that we're looking into, although it's not a big focus of ours. But I do think that Smart Mobility Labs is going to start to explore new ideas into these, test out all those business models. Like, what is it like when this business model interacts with another business model to make things stronger, right? And what are the payment systems like? What are the other kind of things that all the halo system around that? So we're starting to look into some of those things. I think there's a lot of, I don't have any specific ideas to share on that I can share around that, but I do think that there's so much of that is going to be the interoperability of that with all those different systems is going to be an important topic for us to look at.
Are you guys looking at the human interface as well, or capturing audience, or is a comment about, in autonomous vehicles in the future we'll have more of a captive audience perhaps? Are you guys venturing down that route as well?
I don't know if anybody went to CES this year. It was my first year. It was an auto show for me. Like, everything was about cars, and it was about the experience in an autonomous vehicle, what happens to the consumer. Companies like Hyundai, they're investing in air freshener and mood sensing. Everything's like, how do we make this a wonderful experience? So I recommend CES, actually.
Yeah, every single, CES is bigger and bigger into auto, right? It's over the last 7-8 years that I've been there, more and more, it is becoming more of an auto show. They're becoming the prime people for that, yeah. And every single person has a presence in autonomous, which I took a couple years break from CES, and I was really surprised when they came back this year how big of a presence it had in autonomous. And everyone's talking about the entertainment factor of it. Like, what do you do in a car when you don't have to drive it anymore? And is that things like, is this become now this entertainment pod? Does this become a business, pod? Does it become a workout pod? What is it that it becomes? But it's not focused on driving anymore. So that really opens up a lot of possibilities.
If you have any questions, we can show you videos of what people do when you don't have to drive the vehicle anymore. We'd be more than happy to share those.
Are they doing yoga?
We have everything you can imagine in a vehicle when people don't have to drive.
Yeah.
There's goat yoga on the 102 every Wednesday.
Yeah.
Just in general, I think that the creativity and the partnering, it is a wonderful time to be. I mean, there's money right now, people are experimenting, and out of that will come more use cases and more technology, like software, like we've seen in the last 30 years with software. Now we're seeing it with mobility. So it's a good time to be experimenting, I think, with public transportation as well, all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. We see more and more partnerships wanting to push to pilot faster to test things out, because there's a change in pace between policy regulations, what can be okayed for the road versus what software can develop for the road.
And that's really regionally specific, right? Like we were talking about some cities, Arizona, Chandler. There's places that are letting it all, or maybe even you would say Detroit with May Mobility. In Atlanta, I don't know as well, but letting the experiments happen. So that is a local decision.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a fun question here, kind of maybe a trivia-based question. In your opinion, which city needs better traffic management? Los Angeles, Phoenix, Atlanta, or New York? And I'll add to that, the congestion I think is a good thing. It means there's attractions in your city. But I don't know if that sparks any ideas about congestion and traffic management needs.
So it's New York, Phoenix,
LA,
Los Angeles, and Atlanta.
And Atlanta. For our world travelers, national travelers.
To me, the worst of the worst is Los Angeles. But there are challenges in each and every city, which is complex to think about as well, right? The model, in terms of the things that we've been talking about, may not be a rubber stamp from one place to another. This is a very vibrant downtown community. A lot of things going on. Restaurants open at night. It's beautiful here, and I was actually restaurants going on. It's my cousin owns the barbecue place across the street, so I got to put that shameless plug in there. But Phoenix is a very different community. Phoenix is very much a donut community. Downtown, we don't even have a McDonald's that's open past 7 o'clock at night. People live in the suburbs. So if you're going to take on Phoenix's transportation issues, it's the data war is really in the suburbs. Those are the people that you're going to have to win over. Here it's a more urban environment where I think there's different set of challenges, different set of opportunities. But and just like Phoenix is in Atlanta, Atlanta isn't New York City in terms of being on an island with no other way to go except for public transit. So I think that's, businesses are always looking for repeatable business models, right? Can I do this in Detroit and build all the technology and make it a rubber stamp in Atlanta? And that, obviously from a business standpoint, that's very helpful. It cuts gives you a return on your investment. After you do it, after you invent the wheel the first time, you don't have to do it the second and the third and the fourth. But in this environment, it's more complex, and I think that's
a new challenge.
That is certainly one of the big challenges here from a private sector standpoint, working on this with public sector.
I think
transit.
a city that really got smart about making money with congestion is London. I mean, it's not a U.S. city, but charging for being in certain parts of the city with your car at a certain time, there's tax for that, and figuring out how to monetize the city. I think eventually in New York, just going to throw this out, there won't be trucking deliveries during daytime. It'll be in the middle of the night when you're sleeping, and that'll be regulated because it blocks the streets too much. So I think cities can get really smart about monetizing the flow.
One thing I saw on my business travels was in D.C. having variable-based pricing on the fares. So if you're leaving the city or going to the city during rush hour, the cost is different than if you're going off hours. Some cities are taking a look at that congestion issue from a different standpoint
Actually,
as well.
getting to the airports in Manhattan now, there's a huge surcharge that was put on all the Ubers, which is driving people probably back to public transportation because it's gotten so expensive now to take an Uber to the airport.
Yeah, I bet WMATA has a lot of my spare change where I just put 20 on there. I don't know if I need it, but I leave the city and it's still there.
Is the question still open?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. And I'm going to take off my MARTA hat because I don't want people to think that this is somehow a MARTA policy, right? So this is just Kirk. I think the question is more of a cultural one. It becomes inevitable in a place like London when the density and the demand becomes so great that the people scream. What I find interesting, I've had conversations with others, and this is why I took off my MARTA hat. The question of when do you make that investment in alternatives is really the flip side of that question of when do we do congestion management. Because congestion management is saying we have more demand than the capacity will allow, so we need to do something about it. Well, you can go free market and just say, okay, sit in traffic for 6 hours, right? That's a way of doing congestion management, free market. Or you can go in and you can start to alter the economics so that people behave differently, price shifting, whatever it is. That's a cultural decision. I would argue if you build alternatives prior to your demand outstripping your capacity, then you can let the free market say, hey, I prefer this mode over that mode because it's better. I would advocate for that. However, different cities have different priorities in terms of those investments, and you see the outcomes, right? So either you're going to make the investment up front, or you will deal with the headache of over demand or minimum supply. So it's really a question of supply and demand and when you balance that equation.
Yeah, absolutely. I have another fun question from the audience. In your opinion, how far away are autonomous vehicles from being massively adopted. Full saturation of the system, I'll say.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what kind of level of autonomous you mean. But if
Let's go
that's-
level 4 at least.
For me, I think that's definitely in the more 2025 range, you know, and then into more 2020, 2030, where it's more fully autonomous. So I think it's going to be a while. You know, it feels like we're on the verge. We've got, you know, Tesla doing these things over here, but sleeping in the car and all that. But I think for it to be very mainstream, it's going to be a little while.
Yeah, I think Ford said 4 years to start introducing, and then projections are all over for full saturation. But I'd love your insights as well.
Well, I think electric, no question, 2025, we'll see every new car will be electric. But I think autonomous, for me, is 2040. I even go a lot longer than you do. For a full-scale world of autonomous, I think we got a long way to go.
The nerdiest planning researchers agree with you.
I'm a nerd, so it works. But electric is pretty exciting in its own right. I think it creates a lot. Even with the vehicle itself, which I'm sure you're expecting, there's so much more room. Because really the vehicle then just becomes a skateboard on the bottom, and you can create all these interesting things. Tesla hasn't even, with the frunk, they haven't even really pushed it, I don't think, all the way. So
Yeah, more software, more chips, more blockchain.
yeah, more creativity in the car.
This is a question for you, Paul. Talk about what are the hot topics inside Mercedes, if you can, and how is the conversation here in the US different than in Europe or Asia?
Oh, man. Well, I think we have different problems here in the U.S. in terms of traffic, congestions, all the mobility in general than we do in Europe and Asia. And I think in Asia in particular, they're very advanced in a lot of the new business models. They're very fearless in a lot of different ways that they're trying things. And I think part of that is based on their government support, I think, and how they approach it. That may be different than the U.S. So I see a big difference in that. I think in general, U.S. from a business model standpoint is much more interesting. They're experimenting with a lot of different things that maybe, you know, even when that they can't do in Europe, but also China is also very advanced.
Yeah, very strong government, lots of
Yeah.
vision there. Do you guys have any experience of your work in Europe versus US or Asia? Or East Coast, West Coast?
Autonomous, and Tobias, you can confirm or deny, but I didn't think autonomous was possible in Europe yet, at least not in Germany. It's not even... Right, that's what I meant. I didn't mean technology-wise. Yeah, they're not quite as open as we are with experiments, at least Germany, I know for sure. So they can't do as much. Europe can't. China, for sure, though. All these startup companies in the west coast of this country, their market is China. That's who they're building for EV. So they'll get it first, China. And China's committed to zero emissions. So, but that's also debatable whether it was because they couldn't come up with their own powertrain, you know, internal combustion engine, or was it really about the environment? But no question, they don't have a great ICE, so you would know that too. Sorry.
A question for you, Ellen, perhaps. Can you provide details on used car innovations beyond Uber? Are there any other examples for reuse?
Well, I think we're seeing fleets now being created out of used cars and big dealership groups. There's one up in New Jersey called Holman, ARI. They started a fleet company based on used vehicles. We see it in truck, great assets like planes live for 50 years, 60 years. They just keep being serviced and then back out on the road, or the air, if you will. We're seeing that with cars. I think cars, because they live 17, 20 years now, have that same opportunity for people that want to put assets together and run a fleet, provide cars to Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, right out of the dealership. There's going to be more innovation in the used car space. I really believe that.
I think I want to build on that. This is a me question. My apologies for not picking out another one. But as we move to connected vehicles, newer vehicles will have the latest and greatest in them. vehicles that are on the road now will not. So they'll need aftermarket products or a cell phone or something. But that also comes into play with scooters and such. We have very populated curb space with freight. How do you see those two things working? How can we make sure that vehicles that are on the road today and future connected vehicles get the best out of the system as we make the investments to make our streets smarter, or our I'm digging here for a question. Maybe it's a policy question, like how do you incentivize older vehicles to make sure they have the latest tech?
You're asking to look 20 years in the future and then extrapolate policy, so I'll give that a
Yes.
shot. Understanding that caveat, I think when you look back at former economic models of transitions like this, if there's something like EVs, or if there's something like connected vehicles or autonomous vehicles that we as a society want to promote, you end up giving them favor. I think of the Priuses in Southern California in, what was it, 2004, 2005. If you bought a Prius, you got access to the HOV lane, right? And everyone was buying Priuses not because they cared about the environment, sorry, but because they could get in the HOV lane and they could get to work 30 minutes faster. I think what we will do, and I don't know what we'll prefer, but if we prefer connected and autonomous vehicles because they lower the cost of risks, right? You'll see insurance policies that come out and favor it. You will see dedicated lanes that are only connected autonomous vehicles because they can platoon or whatever, right? And then what'll happen is we'll have another conversation about the disenfranchised. Those that can't afford to buy a brand new car have to travel in the slow lane. But the reality is, and no one ever wants to admit this, there's only two universal resources you can exchange: money and time, right? Those that have the money, swap it out for time. Those that don't, sit in the slow lane. And I don't mean that disrespectfully, it's a universal truth across all time. So we will end up with a slower lane with the less connected vehicles, and those that have the abilities will probably have government programs that will go back and retrofit your car to make it safer so that you can drive. I think that's how it will play out.
Yeah.
I have no idea what the timeline is, though.
I think another aspect of this, which would be interesting to see how it goes, is there's various examples of, for lack of a better term, the public sector competing with the private sector. I think the post office is a good example of straight up competition. Conversely, H&R Block and TurboTax were able to shut down the Free Filing Alliance this year. So if you look at some of the data around Uber, they've got hot markets and not hot markets, right? And if you've been in a car with an Uber driver, you know they're chasing the surge pricing, right? So it's a very high percentage. I'm going to say between 20 and 24% of Uber's revenue comes straight out of the airport. So if MARTA were to cherry pick and say, we think there's a business model for offering affordable transit out of the airport, you might bump into a few heads.
Well, the reality is we have the best transit option to the airport,
Yep.
hands down.
Yep.
She's going to take MARTA to the airport. I guarantee she's going to beat the Uber trip, and it'll be 1/10 the price. That because, and I'll go back to what I said, because we laid down the infrastructure 40 years ago to make that happen. If we had to do that today, wouldn't happen, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. I noticed just from living in the Atlanta area and using Uber and Lyft that a lot of them, talking to them, because it is a community, to the drivers, they would say they hang out near Walmart most of the time because that's where they get return customers. And now you see Walmart coming out with new innovative options for getting people to and from their stores, or making it easier for them to not have to hop out of the car, and other stores too. But that goes to kind of a data question that I have of how do you build insights with these new technologies, and how do you get access to data that Uber or someone else might have but not share?
So it's, even before you asked the question, I was thinking about Apple. These big tech companies, Amazon, Apple, definitely in the automotive space. I mean, Amazon is heavily investing in EV fleet skateboards for last mile delivery. Apple, master at creating amazing technology, still playing in the autonomous vehicle space. So I think I'm sorry, now I lost your question.
Just the data they're gathering.
Right,
from
so
all
I know what I was going to say. Sorry, thank you, now I remember. Those guys are masters, those West Coast, those Silicon Valley companies, at data. They know how to use consumer data in a way that traditional automakers don't know how to do it. So it's going to be interesting where they take the data side of the equation. That's my thought.
Oh, I thought you were
Well,
going to
no, I have a
Sorry.
strong opinion, but I don't want to dominate. I didn't know if you guys had a strong position on that.
Look, I think all the data is a big topic. I think for everyone, the ownership of the data is a huge thing, right? And none of the car companies necessarily want to share it, right? Like everyone thinks they're the owner. The car companies think they're the owner. The people think they're the owner. I personally feel like there's some business model out there where the people can own their own data and trade that data for other services, for money back, or whatever that is. So I love to see exploration in that area because I think that's it's a thing that's not going to go away. It's only going to get more and more prevalent, right? And Germany and Europe are dealing with that with GDPR regulations, and I think we're going to get more of that here in the U.S. and everywhere else. So it's going to happen one way or the other. So the topic is going to get bigger and bigger. So I think that it's for me as a business model person, I'm always thinking like, with this thing coming, we see it coming, how do we then take advantage of that with a business model?
I think there's probably one of two futures that are going to happen. The more violent future is what you're seeing play out with the Facebooks and the GDPR, in which you have a civil revolution or war where people go, hey, private sector, sure, you beat us to the punch. You gathered the data, arguably so, but we weren't really willing to sell away that birthright. We want that data back. So you see massive legislation, right? I think there is a more enlightened approach, which we'll see who takes the enlightened path. I think if we view data as a utility in the same way that we view power, water, gas, honestly, mobility, then we can have a more enlightened conversation about should that utility be privatized, and you'll see electric companies that are privatized, or should it be public, right? You'll see electric companies that are public. And what's interesting is different communities have different models. Here, the electric company is privatized. Yeah. In Austin, the electric company is public utility. I scratched my head and said, why did one state pick one over the other? I don't know, there's a history. But the point is, it shows you can run a utility for public good, where everybody, has controlled rates, either on the private sector side or the public sector. That's not the important thing. It's more understanding the nature of the beast and realizing we have to structure it the right way. Don't create a free market, free-for-all, which is what we have now, and that will end poorly.
Yeah, I see much value of sharing the data for example, the OEMs sharing with planners. That way they can make better decisions quicker and better investments versus our current structure where we do household surveys that are 10 years old, but we're still relying on it for policy and investment decisions.
And I would argue, look at electricity. We consider that I don't know, you call it a public right or something, but we consider it life critical. The money is not made on the generation, the distribution of electricity. I mean, it's there, it's regulated, but the value is what do you do with it, right? You add value-added services like I can turn on Wi-Fi, I can turn on lights, I can do 1,000 other things that are where the value in the private money is made, but we all agree it's a utility and it's regulated. I think that's how we have to look at data. View it as a regulated resource, however we model that, and then add the value on top of that.
I mean,
No, it's a really
obviously a lot of possibilities there. It becomes a very interesting topic, and there's an argument for more data, right? I was thinking of my cousin's restaurant, and I was, I'm a different person Monday through Friday when I'm at home, when I'm on the road, right? Like Monday through Friday, living in the suburbs, the chance my wife and I are going out to dinner on a Monday through Thursday. I don't know, I'm not much value to the restaurant business. As a business traveler, I need to eat out every night. And, that's, you think about the public aspect of things, what a nice goodie for local businesses to be able to say Matt Newman's in town. Maybe they'll pick up my MARTA fare.
We'd love that.
And, so there are arguments, the more data, the more opportunity, the different types of business models the public sector can get into. So understanding the privacy concerns, but it's definitely a fascinating area.
If you guys are okay with this, you can say no. I'm thinking of going off script a little. We have about 10 minutes left, and before we get to concluding thoughts, I want to see, we have some questions left on here, but if you guys have any burning questions from the audience, we'd love to take some live questions, if you have any. Happy to keep going through the app. All right, through the app it is. We have a fun question, taking it to a new level of mobility. What are your thoughts on Uber Elevate, aerial ride sharing, which is being tested, which will begin testing, in 2020, with commercial service predicted for Dallas and LA in 2023? So leaving the road and going to the skies, what do you guys think?
I think it's all part of this continuum of movement. You know, planes, trains, whatever it is. Drones are a huge thing for delivery, for warehouses, for movement. So it's not that far off. And I think there's even experiments started by Eric Schmidt of Google in the Bay Area, moving across the Bay with they call them, I went to a whole thing on this in Silicon Valley. Flying taxis, robo-flying taxis exist today already. Uber, that would be cool. Gondola would be great. That would be like romantic, and you'd be in the...
I love this idea. Now, to be full disclosure, Daimler also has investments in competitive companies, so I'm a big fan of this. I think the time has come, and the regulations are still tight, right? And we're doing experiments in places like Singapore and Dubai for things like that are less regulated. But I think, I think it's coming in a big way. I'm not sure exactly when it's going to be full scale, but I think it's the right place to go.
I view it as a economic question, back to the beginning. I think it will absolutely, the technology will get here. I think it will happen, but when I look at the market for it, and I look at the physics, and I look at the cost, unless there's some new laws of physics I haven't heard about, the cost to lift a container up into the air versus propel it along gets prohibitive. So I think what you'll end up with is specialized niche cases, right? Okay, so you're a VC, and you've got to get to the other side of the bay, and you've got 10 minutes. Absolutely, you're going to do it. Are we going to move 50 people in a bus that way? No, we're not, because the economics don't work out right. So I think what you'll see is specialized market solutions for that technology.
Yeah, it's like that, like you were saying earlier about all these specialized markets as well for car sharing. I think it's going to be like that with this first, right? Whether it's emergency transport or VIP taxis or something like that. And then eventually it's going to work its way down, but it'll definitely be specialized at first.
We have a question here of what happens when rideshare is no longer subsidized by investors? Dun, dun, dun. Looking into the future again. How does it change the effectiveness of the service moving forward?
So I read an interesting New York Times deal book piece on Facebook that I think Facebook took 5 years from its IPO to actually make money. And I do think Uber and Lyft will eventually get there and they will make money. They haven't figured, and maybe it's autonomous. Maybe that's how they ultimately make money. But I guess if they weren't subsidized, the rates would go higher. But maybe that's also where these small business owners, like, not that there's that many small dealers anymore. They're not. They're all huge, huge corporations. But different entities start offering fleets in a different way and are profitable.
So I think there's probably two answers. One, if you're looking at just Uber and Lyft, the services they offer will contract. They will contract back to where it's most economically valuable, where they can generate a profit, right? Public sector, by definition, or public transit provides mobility to the not profitable market segment. That's just, that's one of the two things it does. It also moves large volumes, but it provides an equity and a uniformity of mobility options where it's not economically viable. The other thing, though, is, and this is what we started the conversation off, I think what you'll see is a shift in the business model. People will figure out new ways to use the philosophy of T&C on demand, and they'll flip it on its head. I had a conversation with a person, I can't go into too many details because they're still trying to work it out, but they had a business model that was, instead of creating a general purpose fleet, you kind of hinted at this, where anybody can get an Uber, take them anywhere. If you flipped it around and you said, what if there was an Uber fleet that was created for Ponce City Market? It's one of our hot redevelopments. So I'm anywhere within a 10-mile radius. I got a guaranteed ride to Ponce City Market because I'm going to drop $50 on dinner, and I get a free ride home, right? Okay, pick me up anywhere, take me anywhere. And if that Uber fleet, if you will, that privatized Uber fleet, were coordinated with 5 other locations, now you can have a shared fleet, and maybe if they're time separated. So Mercedes-Benz and Ponce City share the same because their events didn't happen, contiguously. I think that's where you're going to see that migrate.
You just made me realize that's all commercial real estate development idea. My development gives you free transportation. That's a reason to live there.
So it's taking the philosophy, it's shifting the business model, and it's attaching it to other interests that would benefit from having a fleet, right? So I think that's where you're going to see when Uber is no longer subsidized, you'll see the business models migrate to where the money's at.
And by the way, they did not have a good IPO.
It did not, it's not going well.
Right, so investors are speculating that this is not a growth business, right?
The strike didn't help.
True, too.
EV was around at the beginning. It was going to be ICE or EV, and even I think hydrogen might have been back in the day. But for some reason, and I forget the reason, but ICE was the selected combustion, choice. So it's not like it's new technology. I think what's new is the batteries have gotten a lot better, give you more range. But we are seeing hydrogen fuel, especially in the heavy truck segment, really kind of taken off. Again, an interesting purpose-built solution. Anheuser-Busch invested in a company called Nikola in Arizona to do a fleet of hydrogen trucks to deliver beer. So, I think all these things have always been around. They just, for so long, we stuck to the combustion engine, and now people don't want that any. That's not good.
For the Smart Sports Tech event. 3rd Thursday of the month. Hope to see you all then.